On the last page of the Grand Chessboard, a book published in 1997 written by a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who called for an eventual upgrading of the already existing United Nations structures after a prolonged phase of gradually expanding cooperation with key Eurasian partners. Then in 2016, Brzezinski added an epilogue to the Grand Chessboard where in the last paragraph he wrote that the world needs an America that seeks to develop a more multipolar world order. Beijing and Moscow would prefer a multipolar world that allows them to isolate Europe, Australia, or Japan in a crisis, as an article called An Alliance of Democracies is Essential from June 16, 2021. And going back to June 2nd, BRICS stands for Just and Equal Multipolar World Order is the title of a video report from CGTN. Then on the 6th of June, an article from Global Times says world rapidly shifting to a multipolar structure, which is what Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote about in the 2016 epilogue to his book, The Grand Chessboard. There was an article published on May 29th called How Can We Build the Next United Nations, which means the current world order, which is represented by the United Nations, just like the League of Nations represented the world order before that, the current world order will have to be destroyed and replaced with a so-called New World Order, which is the beast having 7 heads and 10 horns you can read of in Revelation chapter 13, the one world political system that comes into being at the woe of the 5th trumpet, when the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8 becomes the leopard of Daniel chapter 7. With his selection of recycled Imperial drones, Biden is indicating that he hopes to undo the damage caused by the Trump administration and restore the United States to its role as world cop, says an article from December 14, 2020 called George Bush's neocons are back thanks to the Democrats. The Stalinists, who are symbolized by Ammon, with the neocons being the Trotskyites symbolized by Moab, the left-right paradigm that makes up the unipolar globalist cabal that's trying to sabotage the formation of multipolarity in the modern-day world, according to Lavrov, who is Russia's current foreign minister, in an article from December 12th called Russia Witnessing Attempts to Slow Down Formation of Multipolar World. In another article from December 8th, Lavrov said the West, led by the United States, continues to promote a unipolar international order while Russia and China oppose it. So it's Edom, which means red, versus Ammon and Moab until the great horn of the he-goat, which is the United Nations, gets broken, so to speak, after which the new world order emerges at the woe of the 5th trumpet. Edom means red, and the process of the formation of multipolarity is irrevocable, according to Lavrov, Russia's current foreign minister. So then it's 2 warring factions of globalists with Kenites in leadership positions on both sides. Edom as opposed to Ammon and Moab, who are the unipolar globalists, the Stalinists, and the Trotskyites. And Lavrov also said back in December that our Western colleagues have realized it's impossible to restore a unipolar world and are now attempting to slow down the process, leading to a multipolar world order. So keep Russia's silent hybrid war against the United States in mind, because as we know from Daniel 11 verse 15, the king of the north, which is the Russian Federation at this point in the chapter, shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, the elected officials of the United States, who is the king of the south in Daniel chapter 11 in verses 13 through 15, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. As you can see on Mark13news.com, going back to the beginning of February 2021 to the first of the month, Erdogan moving Turkey toward Russia and China. Turkey being widely believed to be Gomer in Ezekiel chapter 38, where the first 7 verses have to do with the formulation of the alliance of non-Christian nations headed by Edom that will become the bear of Daniel chapter 7 at the woe of the 5th trumpet, when the so-called New World Order comes into being. And you can see there Russia being a guard unto all the company assembled unto them, as it's written in Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 7. Armenia being Togarmah in the first 7 verses of Ezekiel 38, and on February 4th it was reported a top Russian general met with the Armenian defense minister to discuss Russia's close military ties with Armenia, whose prime minister announced plans to deepen Russian-Armenian ties, saying Armenia needs new security guarantees after the recent war war in Nagorno-Karabakh. And then a Tehran Times article says Iran's parliament speaker to visit Russia, a trip aimed at strengthening relations. And going back to Mark13news.com and the post for February 5th, as you can see there, Iran is key for the multipolar world. And the article says the current composition of the Iranian regime is a solid multipolar anchor. The pro-multipolar conservative nationalist forces in Iran control nearly all key institutions of the state. And then skipping down to the next paragraph, Iran's strategic culture will make it hard for the unipolar West to woo Tehran into its camp. There are forces on both sides that will block any potential Iranian defection to the unipolar camp. The United States doesn't appear ready to accept a multipolar world, and it perseveres in believing that its place as a global leader is just as it was after 1945, says an article from February 19th on Middle East Eye called Biden's policy of containing China, Russia, and Iran is no longer viable. 1945 being not only when the third trumpet began to sound when the United Nations came into being, but also when the United States became the third king of the South, as you can see pointed out in the Daniel 11 hypothesis on biblicalresearchlabs.com. An article from February 20th called U.S. Interventionism labels the two sides as the win-win, which is the multipolar globalist, as opposed to zero-sum competition, which is the unipolar, saying a war of narratives with win-win and zero-sum competition as its two faces has begun with full force. The world is currently stuck between a unipolar and a multipolar format, says an RT article from March 23, 2021. The West is pushing for a return to the unipolar era that existed before sanctions on Russia and the economic war against China. However, the two Eurasian giants, Russia and China, have spent the past years adjusting to a multipolar system, Russia being the current king of the North, as you can see in verses 13 through 15 of the Daniel 11 hypothesis, with the United States being the current king of the South. But behind the scenes on both sides is the shadow government of the Kenites. Hegemony and unipolarity is the past, peaceful and equal coexistence and multipolarity is the future, with the present bearing witness to a struggle between both, says an article off Press TV out of Iran called East versus West, a struggle between the past and the future, from April 21st, 2021. An article from April 24th on the Eurasia Review says that the recent announcements of military withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan signal the U.S.'s continued geopolitical decline in a world that is becoming multipolar and highly motivated to bring to a final end the U.S.'s vanishing unipolar moment. The multipolar and the unipolar being the two types of globalists with Kenites in leadership positions on both sides. The left-right paradigm symbolized by Ammon and Moab being the unipolar, with Edom, which means red, being the multipolar. The U.S. strategy seeks to keep other countries permanently subordinate and backward, while many other countries, including China and Russia, aspire to a multipolar, equitable, and just world order. So again, multipolar globalists as opposed to unipolar globalists through the king of the North and the king of the South. And once the great horn of the he-goat is broken, which is the United Nations system, the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8 becomes the leopard of Daniel chapter 7 whenever Satan and his angels get cast to earth. Daniel's fourth beast, that is to say. That's when the lion and the bear come into being, the fourth king of the South and the fourth king of the North. And then after the deadly wound, it goes from being a one-world political system to a one-world religious system whenever Satan appears as the false Christ in Jerusalem at the woe of the sixth trumpet. Satan's role of Antichrist being the king of Babylon of the end times, and whenever he appears in Jerusalem in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, which was 7 years but is now 5 months, the 70 evenings begin, which the 70 years in captivity to the Babylon of old were a type of. The true Christ won't return at all until the woe of the seventh trumpet as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, destroying Satan's role of Antichrist as well as his one world system. And as the true Christ says in the last verse of Mark chapter 13, what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch.
Let me warn you,
A new world order.
and let me warn the nation.
A new world order.
Let me warn you,
A new world order.
and let me warn the nation.
We're
order our free booklet, call 1-800-816-2432 or email us at mark13records@mail.com.
And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, he named his uncle, Frederick Delano, as the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Virginia. Previously, Frederick Delano had been named to the original board of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in 1914. So you had a very close link between Drug Incorporated, the worldwide drug business, and the Federal Reserve System. Now, you may have seen a few stories in recent months that the Federal Reserve banks are the principal banks which are laundering the money for the international drug trade. That is absolutely true. But what people don't know is that the Federal Reserve System has always been closely connected with the world drug trade. And because you had a very prominent scion of a financial family in Washington named George Bush, he was named as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which was and is the principal agency directing the worldwide operations of Drug Incorporated. George Bush came from a banking house called Brown Brothers Harriman. The Harriman Railroad fortune was itself a Rothschild operation. E.H. Harriman was financed in the Union Pacific Railroad by Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb Company, the same banking house which sent Paul Warburg to Jekyll Island to write the Federal Reserve Act in 1910. One of the fascinating things about the research I've done over the past 40 years is that it becomes easier each year because I run into the same names no matter what, whether I'm investigating the medical monopoly, the legal monopoly, or the money monopoly. There are the same people. I already have their complete histories, their family histories, their business histories. So it's a very easy task to put these pieces into the puzzle.
The first mass-produced commercial television hit the market in 1946, and it soon became one of the most quickly adopted technologies in history to that point, finding its way into the majority of American homes within a decade. Strangely, as sociologist Robert Putnam documented in his 2000 bestseller, Bowling Alone, the era of television adoption precisely coincides with a severe drop-off in civic engagement among the American public. Could there be a relation? If so, what could it be? One intriguing possibility comes from research conducted by Herbert Krugman in 1969. Krugman, who would go on to become manager of public opinion research at General Electric in the 1970s, was interested to discover what happens physiologically in the brain of a person watching TV. He taped a single electrode to the back of his test subject's head and ran the wire to a Grass Model 7 polygraph, which in turn interfaced with a Honeywell 7600 computer and a CAT 400B computer. He turned on the TV and began monitoring the brain waves of his subject. He found through repeated testing that within about 30 seconds, the brain waves switched from predominantly beta waves, indicating alert and conscious attention, to predominantly alpha waves, indicating an unfocused receptive lack of attention. In a word, TV hypnotizes its viewers.
To order our free DVD, call 1-800-816-2432 or email us at mark13records@mail.com.
Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood to confirm and to strengthen him, and now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, meaning ultimately Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh, beginning with the First World War, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, meaning the lion of Daniel chapter 7, that won't come into being until the woe of the 5th trumpet, and it'll be made up of Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh. Ephraim being the United Kingdom, including the British Commonwealth. Judah is Germany, but by the time the 5-month-long hour of temptation begins, Germany will have most likely filled in the post-Brexit power vacuum, so then Germany including Europe, and Manasseh is the United States. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. Looking forward to when the great horn of the he-goat gets broken, meaning the United Nations, and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, which always means the 5-month-long hour of temptation, in this case at the beginning of it, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those, meaning the four beasts of Daniel chapter 7 that make up the one world system of Revelation 13. It'll start out as a one world political system at the woe of the fifth trumpet when Satan and his angels get cast to earth, and then it'll receive a deadly wound, after which it becomes a one world religious system when Satan appears as the Antichrist at the woe of the sixth trumpet. And the king of the south, meaning the first king of the south, which is Ephraim, shall be strong, and one of his princes, meaning Manasseh, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion, and in the end of years they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south, meaning the scepter of Judah, which is now in London, the house of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, now being called the house of Windsor, shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, meaning the Treaty of London in 1915, between England and Tsarist Russia, as well as France and Italy.
The Allies hoped that Italy's entry into the war would create a new front against Austria-Hungary, forcing the Central Powers to redirect their military resources.
Italy, swayed by British and French promises of territorial gains at Austria-Hungary's expense, joins the Allies, declaring war on Austria-Hungary and later the Ottoman Empire and Germany. The Italian army makes its first assault against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River, but is repulsed with heavy losses. Meanwhile, the Allies face a crisis on the Eastern Front. The Russians have begun a general retreat, abandoning Poland. German troops enter Warsaw on the 5th of August. Tsar Nicholas II dismisses the Russian army's commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nicholas, and takes personal command. It will prove disastrous for the Tsar.
Tsarist Russia being the first king of the north before it became Soviet Russia, which is the second king of the north. Again, World War I is the starting point here, and Tsar Nicholas II was the cousin of the King of England. But she, meaning the scepter of Judah in Russia, shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, Tsar Nicholas II, along with his wife and children, having been murdered during the Bolshevik Revolution.
In July 1918, the Yekaterinburg Reds feared that a Czech army and White Russian forces were on their way to rescue the Tsar. The decision was made to act. Yakov Yurovsky was the hardliner chosen by the local committee to take over command of the House of Exile. The guards, known to have become affectionate towards the family, were removed. Yurovsky brought in new men with a new mission: to execute the prisoners. In the cellar of this house, in 20 horrific minutes, on the night of July 17th, 1918, the last chapter of the Romanovs would be written. Just after midnight, the royals are roused from sleep by guards. The family is told that because of anarchist unrest in the town, the upper rooms of the house have become unsafe, that there may be shooting in the streets. The Tsar, his wife, and 5 children, along with their 4 attendants, all 11 that make up the royal household, are brought down into the cellar for their own safety. Yurovsky and his men enter the room.
But she, meaning the scepter of Judah in Russia, shall be given up, and they that brought her, meaning the Romanov dynasty, and he that begat her, because God was thrown out of the country, so to speak, and he that strengthened her in these times, meaning Christ, when atheistic communism replaced the Romanovs, who were a Christian dynasty of the king line of Judah. As you can see in Amos chapter 2, verse 1, Moab burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime, Ammon and Moab being symbolic of Stalinism Lenism and Trotskyism in the ultimate futurist sense. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. This being when the Bolshevik Revolution caused Tsarist Russia, which was the first king of the north, to be replaced with Soviet Russia, which was the second king of the north. Out of a branch of her roots, meaning out of a branch of the roots of the scepter of Judah, because the Bolshevik Revolution was orchestrated by the Kenites from Wall Street.
Trotsky was in New York. He had no income. I summed his income for the year he was in New York. It was about $600. Yet he lived in an apartment. He had a chauffeured limousine. He had a refrigerator, which was very rare in those days. He left New York and went to Canada on his way to the revolution. He had $10,000 in gold on him. He didn't earn more than $600 in New York. He was financed out of New York. There's no question about that. The British took him off the ship in Halifax, Canada. I got the Canadian archives. They knew who he was. They knew who Trotsky was. They knew he was going to start a revolution in Russia. Instructions from London came to put Trotsky back on the boat with his party and allow them to go forward. So there is no question that Woodrow Wilson, who issued the passport for Trotsky, and the New York financiers who financed Trotsky, and the British Foreign Office allowed Trotsky to perform his part in the revolution. Now over in Switzerland you get Lenin, who was in exile. He went through Germany in the famous sealed train by permission and with the encouragement of the German General Staff. And yet Germany and Britain were supposed to be fighting each other. And you get them both moving these two key revolutionaries into place inside Russia. And then of course the rest is history. They created the revolution with no more than about 10,000 revolutionaries. They needed assistance from the West, and they got assistance from Germany, from Britain, and from the United States to continue and consolidate the revolution.
The United States having been brought into being when 13 British colonies rebelled against the King of England, who was of the king line of Judah, and shall also carry captives into Egypt, which is symbolic of bondage, their gods with a lowercase g, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land, signifying the end of World War I. What follows looks forward to World War II, with the second king of the south being Germany and the second king of the north Soviet Russia. But his sons, meaning Judah, which is Germany, the second king of the south, shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through, then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. And the king of the south, which again is Germany, during the Second World War, at this point in the chapter, shall be moved with choler and shall come forth and fight with them, even with the king of the north, meaning when Germany invaded Soviet Russia in 1941. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. The result of the Second World War being the United Nations in 1945, when the king of the south went from being Germany, which is Judah, to the United States, which is Manasseh.
The League of Nations had effectively collapsed with the war's onset. Its successor was the United Nations, a bolder step toward world government. The UN began with a group of CFR members in the State Department. Working under Secretary of State Cordell Hull, they called themselves the Informal Agenda Group. The group drew up the original plan for the UN, then consulted 3 attorneys, all CFR members, who declared the scheme constitutional. Subsequently, they met with President Roosevelt, who approved the plan and publicly announced it the same day. After that, FDR made establishing the UN his top priority for post-war planning, just as the League of Nations had been to Wilson. At the UN's founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, most of the American delegates, 47, were CFR members.
As you can see in Revelation chapter 8 verse 10, and the third angel sounded in 1945 when the United Nations came into being, but what follows won't happen until the woe of the fifth trumpet, when Satan and his angels get cast to earth, which is when the one world political system comes into being after the United Nations, which is the great horn of the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8 verse 8, gets broken. And there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, meaning Satan when he gets cast to earth at the woe of the fifth trumpet, but what follows won't happen until Satan appears as the Antichrist at the woe of the sixth trumpet. And it, meaning Satan, fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. To fall upon being a figure of speech that means to kill, in this case spiritually, at the woe of the sixth trumpet, when Satan appears as the Antichrist, which is when most Christians will be killed spiritually when they begin worshiping Satan instead of Christ, and the Christian nations, which are symbolized by the lion of Daniel chapter 7, become non-Christian nations. And then as you can see in Revelation chapter 8 verse 11, and the name of the star is called wormwood, and the third part of the waters, meaning most Christians became wormwood, and many men died spiritually of the waters because they were made bitter. The third trumpet lines up with the hidden dynasty of politics in 1945, which again is when the United Nations came into being, which is the great horn of the he-goat. But then once the United Nations gets broken, the one world political system emerges at the woe of the fifth trumpet, when Satan and his angels get cast to earth, which is when the 5-month-long hour of temptation begins, when the four beasts of Daniel chapter 7 all rise up together at the same time, including Daniel's fourth beast, which is exclusively supernatural. The second seal and the third vial line up with the third trumpet, so then 233, which again lines up with the hidden dynasty of politics, as well as Mark 13, beginning with verse 7, where Christ says, "And when ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, be ye not troubled, for such things must needs be, but the end shall not be yet," leading up to 1945, where the world war is bringing about the United Nations, which again is the great horn of the he-goat, with the he-goat itself being the shadow government of the Kenites. For nation shall rise against nation, meaning the Kenite nation rising against itself through two warring factions on either the multipolar or the unipolar end of the globalist spectrum. The Kenites on the multipolar end of the globalist spectrum, for the most part, control Edom, which is the Russian Federation geopolitically, and the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy, which is now formulating, as opposed to the unipolarist Kenites, who for the most part control the left-right paradigm, which is symbolized by Ammon and Moab. Once the United Nations gets broken, the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8 becomes the leopard of Daniel chapter 7, meaning the Kenites and their four hidden dynasties providing the infrastructure for the one world system that won't come into being until the woe of the fifth trumpet, which is also when the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy becomes the bear of Daniel chapter 7, when the one world political system emerges, which will then be wounded to death, which is what kingdom against kingdom means in Mark 13, as well as Matthew 24 and Luke 21. As you can see in Daniel chapter 11 verses 25 through 27, the deadly wound will most likely come from the king of the south, which is the lion of Daniel chapter 7 at that point in the chapter, meaning one or more of the countries on one of the 7 continents, which will be geopolitically part of the lion, which is symbolic of the Christian nations, will most likely declare independence from the one world political system, which will wound the entire system to death, because without all the countries of the world participating, it can't be a one world system. As you can see in Revelation chapter 13 verse 14, the deadly wound will be by a sword, and as you can see in the second seal in Revelation chapter 6 verse 4, the rider of the red horse was given a great sword. And not only does Edom mean red, but part of the curse placed on Esau was that by his sword he would live, as you can see in Genesis 27:40. So then it could be that the influence of the Kenites on the multipolar end of the globalist spectrum through Edom on the Christian nations is what causes the deadly wound to the one world political system. And then after the deadly wound is when Satan appears as the Antichrist and the Christian nations become non-Christian nations, because that's when most Christians begin worshiping Satan instead of Christ, which is what Antichrist means. And there shall be earthquakes in diverse places, meaning major geopolitical shifts, especially the shift that happens after the deadly wound from a one world political system to a one world religious religious system when Satan appears as the Antichrist in the midst of Daniel's 70th week, which was 7 years but is now 5 months.
The battle for the mind of North America will be fought in the video arena.
The only truth you know is what you get over this tube.
You find me any TVs? I could sure use some.
The television screen is the retina of the mind's eye.
The constant, carefully shaped messages on television guide the public to predetermined conclusions.
Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube.
The flicker rate on the television is very, very important. It was timed to be so many cycles per second, and it actually just meets with the brain patterns from alpha state.
You're never going to get any truth from us.
When our brain sees it through our eyes, we start to adopt that flicker rate in our mind and go into deep alpha state.
Therefore, the television screen is part of the physical structure of the brain.
The constant flow of entertainment, news, and information that is consumed by the American public shapes their perception of the reality in which they live.
We deal in illusions, man. None of it is true.
They're hypnotized, in fact. Why would they give that particular flicker rate when they could have chosen of a whole variety of flicker rates? It wasn't an essential thing to have. So it was done for a purpose. It was meant to be hypnotic. It was meant to be used as a tool of propaganda and indoctrination.
Therefore, whatever appears on the television screen emerges as raw experience for those who watch it.
You're beginning to believe the illusions we're spinning here. You're beginning to think that the tube is reality and that your own lives are unreal.
Therefore, television is reality, and reality is less than television.
By controlling the dissemination of information, broadcasters and their corporate heads are able to control the masses.
It's okay. You saw it on the television.
This conference of the United Nations was conceived by the late Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the leading architects for a world security organization that could put an end to all wars on this earth.
Since 1933, the Democratic Party of the United States had been totally taken over by the Stalinist wing of the Communist Party. And of course you had Bella Moskowitz, who masterminded the entire Roosevelt campaign for the presidency. And then she died suddenly just before Roosevelt was inaugurated.
Hitler has often protested that his plans for conquest do not extend across the Atlantic Ocean, but his submarines and radars prove otherwise. And so does the entire design of his new world order.
December 7th, 1941. The Japanese Navy attacks the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, sinking or heavily damaging 18 naval vessels and leaving over 2,000 Americans dead. This is the event that propels America into World War II.
And so Franklin D. Roosevelt swept into the White House, and the first thing he did was to recognize the Stalinist regime in Russia, the Soviet. And this was because his entire personal staff was composed of the Harold Ware Cell of Communists, which was a fanatical Stalinist group.
After Soviet Russia fell, it was then replaced with the Russian Federation, which is the third king of the North. For the king of the North, meaning the Russian Federation, shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And it's at this time the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy is formulating, headed by Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, meaning most likely Moscow and Tobolsk. But it won't be until the woe of the fifth trumpet that the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy becomes the bear of Daniel chapter 7. And in those times, meaning the times we're now in, there shall many stand up against the king of the south, meaning the United States. Also the robbers of thy people, meaning the Kenites, shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, meaning the vision of a one-world system, but they shall fall. This word translated as fall here is from a Hebrew word, which in this case means to fail, because no matter what the Kenites do to try and bring about the New World Order, as it's called, it won't emerge until Satan and his angels get cast to earth at the woe of the fifth trumpet. As Christ says in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, nation shall rise against nation, meaning the Kenite nation rising against itself through two warring factions. The Kenites on the multipolar end of the globalist spectrum, who for the most part control the Russian Federation, as opposed to the unipolarist Kenites, who for the most part control the left-right paradigm, which is really Stalinism and Trotskyism, which again is symbolized by Ammon and Moab. So the king of the north, which again is the Russian Federation, at this point in the chapter shall come and cast up a mountain, take the most spent cities. And operating within the left-right paradigm and media outlets of the West are also the hidden agents of Edom, working to introduce geopolitical disorder into internal American activity, encouraging all kinds of separatism and ethnic, social, and racial conflicts, actively supporting all dissident movements, extremist, racist, and sectarian groups, thus destabilizing internal political processes in the United States, as the Russian propagandist Alexander Dugin wrote in his book Foundations of Geopolitics back in 1997. And the arms of the South shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, meaning his elected officials, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. And now we come to verses 16 through 19, which rewind back to the result of the First World War, which was the League of Nations. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, having paved the way for Kenite-occupied Israel to come into being, the glorious land here being that same geographic location. He, meaning the League of Nations, shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom and upright ones with him, the Balfour Declaration having led to the British Mandate. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, meaning Jerusalem, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. After this he shall turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, because the nations who joined the League of Nations would later join the United Nations, and at the woe of the fifth trumpet will become part of the one world political system that will emerge at that time when Satan and his angels get cast to earth. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease, meaning this first attempt at a global government would fail when World War II broke out in 1939. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. And with the covenant of the League of Nations originating at the Paris Peace Conference, what happened to France during World War II illustrates what a failure this attempt at so-called world peace was, but it did provide the skeletal structure for the next step toward one worldism, which is the United Nations, the great horn of the he-goat written of in Daniel chapter 8. Then shall stand up in his estate, meaning in the estate of the League of Nations, one who sends a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. And it was the United Nations that brought about the Paris Climate Accord that went into effect in 2016. But within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle, when the United Nations, which again is the great horn of the he-goat, as well as the one who sends a raiser of taxes, gets destroyed and then replaced with the so-called New World Order when Satan and his angels get cast to earth at the woe of the fifth trumpet, when the four beasts of Daniel chapter 7 emerge, including Daniel's fourth beast, which is exclusively supernatural. That about does it for this installment of Biblical Questions and Answers, and next week you might have your questions answered by either leaving a question on our voicemail by calling 1-800-816-2432, emailing us at mark13records@mail.com, or by going to our Discord server and asking a question on the Questions and Answers text channel. Until next time, over and out.